Dodge and Ford are two of the most legendary American auto brands of the last 100 years, if not for all time. They've competed in the automotive marketplace longer than any of us have been alive, and their products have shaped the fabric of the auto industry as we know it today, for better or worse. But their influence on American culture has not been limited to the cars they've created. No, perhaps the most overlooked influence of Ford and Dodge is in a court case from over a century ago that set a precedent not only for how corporations conduct business, but for how they choose not to do business. Because in a perfect world, corporations would have the freedom of benevolence, and in some ways, they still do. Nothing is stopping a corporation from philanthropy, but when Henry Ford faced off in a courtroom against John and Horace Dodge, the end result was a decision that set the standard for what it means to run a corporation, and who's really in charge at the end of the day. So sit back, relax, and take a trip through a tale of automotive history, corporate intrigue, and the shifting tides of American law. This is RCR Stories, Dodge versus Ford. Henry Ford was born on July 30th, 1863, in Springwells Township, Michigan. One of 6 children, Henry's formal education pretty much ended with the 8th grade, yet he had a mind for engineering, spending an inordinate amount of time tinkering with pocket watches and marveling at the Nichols and Shepard road engine, and it seemingly brought him to a very simple understanding that not all vehicles were horse-drawn, nor would they be forever. Yet Henry Ford's attempted ventures into the auto industry throughout his early adulthood didn't exactly bear fruit. He founded the Detroit Automobile Company in 1899, but it would only last 2 years before he realized that the cars were awful and they cost too much money. So Ford teamed up with lumber baron William Murphy and gathered several other investors to start fresh with the Henry Ford Company in 1901. By this point, Ford had successfully built and raced a car capable of achieving 26 horsepower, thanks to the help of engineer C. Harold Wills. And look, I know 26 horsepower really isn't a lot, but again, this was the dawn of the 20th century. And hey, it certainly beat his first attempt a decade earlier. A little motorized car that made only 4 horsepower on a 2-cylinder engine. Yeah, it wasn't great. Although Henry Ford did supposedly drive that for at least 1,000 miles, so it was at least mechanically sound enough to function over a prolonged period of time. But neither of these cars made it to mass production, and like the Detroit Automobile Company, the Henry Ford Company also failed. When Henry left, less than a year after it was founded. The reason? Long story short, Ford didn't like that he held a minority stake in a company with his own damn name on it, and it caused him to lash out by focusing more and more of his time, energy, and resources into making non-viable race cars that he would then try and race himself. Murphy was fed up, and so he brought in a consultant named Henry Leland to inspect the company and report to the board on how business could be improved. And that was pretty much it for Ford, who felt the board were meddling parasites who didn't know anything about making cars. Never mind that Henry Leland wasn't just some random guy off the street. His company, Leland and Falconer, supplied engines to Ransom Eli Olds, whose Olds Motor Vehicle Company later became Oldsmobile. But Ford didn't want pushback from anybody, so he left the company. while Murphy and Leland renamed the Henry Ford Company the Cadillac Automobile Company. Yeah, Henry Ford's hubris essentially created a new competitor to any empire that he might eventually create. Now, he was able to start a third company with coal industry businessman and longtime acquaintance Alexander Malcolmson, even going as far as to produce an actual car, the Model A, which brought the company positive attention. But the thing is, they weren't actually selling enough of them to afford to pay their parts supplier. As legend has it, their company, Ford and Malcolmson Limited, spent nearly all of their $28,000 starting capital to make the 0304 Model A happen, leaving them with just $223.65 in the bank once the first Model A officially sold. Now, I don't think I have to tell you how screwed they'd have been if their suppliers pulled out, as that would mean yet another failed company to Henry Ford's name. You see, the part suppliers, they were a pair of brothers who were experienced machinists in the automotive industry, and were potentially more valuable to Ford and Malcolmson as part of their company than as people to whom they owed money. So Ford and Malcolmson made the decision that, in lieu of paying these two brothers, they would instead offer them 10% equity in the company, 5% each, in exchange for a modest $10,000 investment. They would also receive a spot on the board of directors. The names of these brothers? John and Horace Dodge. Ford and Malcolmson restructured their company with the Dodge brothers, and, with the support of several financial backers, founded the newly christened Ford Motor Company in 1903. It was the start of a significant partnership between seemingly like-minded individuals with a whole lot in common. Like Henry Ford, John and Horace Dodge were born on a Michigan farm in the town of Niles, some 3 hours from Springwells Township where Ford had been born. John was the elder, born on October 25, 1864, while Horace was born nearly 4 years later on May 17, 1868. And throughout their childhood and well into their adulthood, the brothers were practically joined at the hip. They worked together, they fought together, they drank together, particularly Horace, who reportedly drank to excess. I'm talking Ernest Hemingway amounts of booze. As stated in author Charles K. Hyde's 2003 book, Riding the Roller Coaster, A History of the Chrysler Corporation, John was the more business-minded of the two, while Horace was the mechanic of the family, gifted in tinkering and devising inventions, such as a dirt-proof ball bearing that Horace later got patented, which earned the attention of third-party investors who got the brothers started in the bicycle business. And while this didn't last for very long, it earned them the capital to pursue a career as independent machinists, opening their own shop in Detroit at the turn of the century. Before long, they were building transmissions for Olds Motor Vehicle Company, which got the attention of Henry Ford, and now we're all caught up. Yet for all the similarities Ford shared with the Dodge brothers, they had differences just as profound. Ford's grounded persona made him the admiration of elitist and everyman alike, and so he was welcomed in high society. But the brothers Dodge, they did drink a lot, and they were a bit rough around the edges. But writer Aaron Marquis's 2018 Jalopnik article on the Ford versus Dodge rivalry suggests that their reputation as two Midwestern bar-hopping troublemakers only got worse once they started to make serious money. Quote, "The Dodge brothers weren't always so welcome in polite society. Both Horace and John were incredibly prolific drunks and public rabble-rousers. Horace once started a brawl in a bar and then threatened to kill the owner of the newspaper that reported it. John knocked a man out cold on the street when the passerby mocked him for being unable to crank-start his Ford. And when a Grosse Pointe Country Club denied John membership, he built a huge mansion directly across the street with a 12-car garage. They were loud and uncouth, even for a loud, uncouth town like turn-of-the-century Detroit. End quote. This is without even getting into an incident detailed in Charles K. Hyde's biography of the brothers, in which they beat the hell out of a Detroit attorney with his own cane, which is bad enough until you learn that the attorney was disabled, having wooden prosthetic legs. So yeah, not great guys. However, despite their rough exterior, the Dodge brothers were making their way into the upper crust merely by virtue of their business success. Ford's offer of a minority stake in Ford Motor Company made them incredibly wealthy, and it had the effect of making them well-known figures in the Detroit social scene, for reasons other than their antics. Yet the Dodge brothers' optimism about their future was tempered by Henry Ford's ruthlessness, as they witnessed firsthand just how Henry did business when he didn't want to do business anymore. In 1905, Ford decided he wanted to squeeze Alexander Malcolmson out of his company, but he couldn't just remove him directly, so Ford devised a plan to get Malcolmson removed by creating a shell company without including him, and then signing over the exclusive manufacturing rights for the Model A's successor to that company. And this was done to provoke Malcolmson, and it worked. Furious, Malcolmson decided to start his own automobile company to rival Ford directly. And this put Malcolmson in breach of his loyalty clause, which allowed the board to then remove him. Henry Ford bought all of Malcolmson's shares, along with those of anybody loyal to Malcolmson who wanted out. And just like that, Henry Ford was the majority stakeholder, figuratively righting the wrong of the Henry Ford Company. When the Model T released in 1908, Ford Motor Company quickly became the American automotive brand. Between 1908 and 1919, nearly 3.4 million Model Ts were sold, taking into account a 2015 report by the Detroit News, which noted that 200,000 motorized vehicles were active in the United States in 1909 before the figure ballooned to 2.25 million in 1916. Ford was a clear pioneer in the automobile's proliferation, and it was thanks to help from the Dodge brothers. So then, how did these two forces find themselves on opposite sides of a courtroom? The thing about Henry Ford is that, yeah, he had a rural upbringing. He worked on his family's farm. He did a bunch of menial jobs. And so he did have this modest charm that drew people in, because he could identify with people at various income levels, It wasn't like he had always been rich, and it's not like he had been rich for so long that he forgot what it was like being a farmhand. But from reading biographies of the guy, it really does seem like he was simply projecting an image of benevolence that could not be sustained through his personal beliefs. This was a man who wasn't shy about his hatred for others, whether it was the shareholders he viewed as, quote, parasites, or the Jewish people for whom he had undisguised contempt. I go into that a bit more in my extensive history of one of Henry Ford's biggest failures that is also among his least recognized, the Brazilian town of Fordlandia. I've included a link to that video in the description, but needless to say, if the Dodge brothers weren't particularly great guys, Henry Ford was right there with them. But hey, Henry Ford was acclaimed for his innovations such as the assembly line. Never mind that it wasn't even his idea, having come from 4 Ford employees, one of whom was C. Harold Wills, who had helped him create his first viable racing prototype a few years earlier. But whether or not it had been his idea, the assembly line helped Ford to make money hand over fist because it increased output while cutting back on production and labor expenses. However, an unintended consequence of the assembly line was that it made the workers unhappy because it was a mind-numbingly, soul-crushingly tedious adjustment to the work that they had already been doing. As a result, people were calling off more frequently or just outright quitting altogether, and this set the company behind, resulting in lost money over time. So Ford decided to initiate a wage increase to $5 a day, a nice, tidy sum that would keep workers compliant while nipping all talk of unionization in the bud. Of course, Ford dressed it up as this graceful gesture, as if he was doing this out of the goodness of his heart. But behind the scenes, Ford assembled a task force whose sole purpose was to essentially spy on employees, inspect their homes, their spending habits, their lifestyles, even their hygiene, to decide whether they even merited the wage increase, which was akin to double what they had been earning. He was basically paying workers a dividend, or a share of the profits of the company, when dividends were usually only paid out to shareholders. Yet it was necessary to quell the growing discontent in Ford's factories. Author Stephen M. Bainbridge goes into this in greater detail in his report, Why We Should Keep Teaching Dodge vs. Ford Motor Company. Quote, "Assembly line work a century ago was repetitive, often boring, and sometimes dangerous. As a result, Ford Motor Company faced massive problems with absenteeism and turnover. In 1914, for example, absenteeism was such a problem that FMC had to maintain a workforce of 20,000 to ensure that the necessary 10,000 workers would show up on any given day. Both the higher pay and its structure were intended to discourage absenteeism and turnover. In addition to providing pay so high that workers who lost their job would not be able to replace their lost income, the profit-sharing aspect of the pay structure gave workers a feeling of ownership in the enterprise that further incentivized them. Not surprisingly, the policy successfully reduced absenteeism, increased employee retention, and attracted new workers. Upon introduction, for example, the wage plan slashed employee turnover from an annual rate of 400% to 50%, and, after just 1 year, to a mere 15%. End quote. With production back on track, Henry Ford put forward plans to begin building a monolithic, state-of-the-art compound on the River Rouge in Detroit that would allow the vertical integration of his entire supply chain and result in thousands of cars being produced per day. At that point, no other automaker in America could hope to compete with Ford. But in order to build this factory, Ford had to discontinue paying dividends to shareholders. He wouldn't be able to really afford it otherwise. As we've established, Henry Ford always hated having shareholders. He didn't like having to pay dividends to people he felt didn't deserve the money they were earning because in his eyes, they weren't really earning it. He didn't see their investment as something worthy of continuous reimbursement. He had already paid several special dividends to the tune of over $10 million in 1913 alone, a figure that would only increase in the 2 years that followed. Ford felt he'd paid enough, and he wanted to reinvest that money into the business in order to make this River Rouge plant a reality. and he also needed that dividend money in order to maintain the wage increase to keep the workers in line. He essentially had three choices: pay dividends, build the River Rouge facility, or pay the wage increase for the workers. You can pick two of them, but you can't have all three. And so he chose the River Rouge facility and the workers. And yet, there was actually another big reason Ford didn't want to pay shareholders anymore. You see, the Dodge brothers had announced their intention to start their own automotive company, the Dodge Brothers Motor Company, but didn't want a repeat of the Malcolmson situation, so they tendered their resignation in 1913, recognizing that it was a conflict of interest to remain on the board while creating a direct competitor with Ford. Yet they were able to retain their shares, which meant they were able to continue receiving dividends. This created a new problem for Henry Ford. Before, he just wanted to stop dividends so he could afford to pay the wage increase and build the River Rouge plant. But now, he needed to stop paying dividends because he knew the money was being used to fund the development of a rival automaker. But Ford couldn't just say the quiet part out loud, or else he'd come across as one of those bigwigs trying to keep the smaller guy down, and not the aw shucks everyman who believed any mountain could be summited by one's own bootstraps. So Ford announced plans to discontinue paying out the special dividends, explaining that the money would be reinvested into the business and its workers. And, well, it went over about as well as you'd expect among shareholders. The Dodge brothers did not agree with the decision, obviously, and while they'd made attempts to meet with Ford to talk about it, they were apparently rebuffed at every turn. Yet even as they went their separate ways in business, Ford appeared to remain on mostly decent terms with the Dodge brothers on a personal level. Well, at least decent enough terms for them to attend the wedding of his son, Edsel Ford. But the day after the wedding, in that autumn of 1916, Henry Ford received a letter from the Dodge brothers. It read, in part, quote, "We have, for some time, as you know, been endeavoring to make an appointment to see you, for the purpose, as you assumed and informed one of your associates, of discussing the affairs of the Ford Motor Company from the standpoint of our interest as stockholders, and with a view to securing action by the board of directors looking to a very substantial distribution from its cash surplus as dividends. Not having been able to make an appointment to discuss the matter with you personally, as we very much desired to do, we write you this letter upon the subject. The conditions shown by your recent financial statement, showing approximately $60 million of net profits for the past year, and cash surplus in bank exceeding $50 million, it seems to us would suggest, without the action being requested, the propriety of the board taking prompt action to distribute a large part of the accumulated cash surplus as dividends to the stockholders to whom it belongs. While we would be sorry to have any controversy over the matter, we feel that your attitude toward the stockholders of the company is entirely unwarranted. The statements that you have made that the stockholders are and have been receiving as dividends all they are entitled to shows a most extraordinary state of mind if it represents your real feelings. Another matter that we desire brought to the attention of the board is our contention as stockholders that the company has no right to use the company's earnings in the continued extension of the plants and property of the company. Indeed, from our point of view, they have already exceeded their authority in this direction." End quote. The Dodge brothers were filing suit against Henry Ford to distribute the dividends he was planning to withhold. Yet that wasn't the only, or even the main, objective of the lawsuit. as the lawsuit also petitioned the court to prevent Ford from building that River Rouge plant. To my understanding, it wasn't really about the dividends for the Dodge brothers. They had the money to bankroll their car company. But if Henry Ford built that plant, he would essentially crowd out the market through sheer volume and prevent any smaller automakers from being able to compete unless they were able to match Ford at scale. And nobody would have been able to in 1916. Now, yes, it does seem like a particularly cold-blooded move to celebrate with the guy at his son's wedding, knowing full well you were going to slide a figurative knife between his ribs the next day. But honestly, this might not have been as intentionally cold-hearted as history suggests, as legend has it that the brothers had already filed the suit before they even got the invites to the wedding, and actually tried to back out of going, but Edsel's fiancée had been an old acquaintance of John Dodge, and so he felt compelled to go. Man, the damage we can do when we feel backed into being polite. The trial began on May 21st, 1917. The Dodge brothers argued from their position as shareholders, asserting that Henry Ford was not acting in the company's best interests. And while that seems ridiculous when you consider how much money the company stood to gain from the River Rouge plant and the tens of millions of dollars the Dodge brothers had already made off of their initial $10,000 investment, it makes a lot more sense when you remember that this was all happening in the middle of World War I. This plant was going to be an enormous expense and require resources the company may not have been able to spare. There was also no way of knowing what the market would look like on the other side of the conflict, and if there would even be demand for cars at all. In this sense, building the plant was a reckless act of hubris that imperiled the financial futures of everyone invested in the company, to say nothing of what it would mean for healthy competition in the automotive sector. Now, in order to win this case, all Henry Ford really had to do was express the common sense problems that canceling dividends would solve. I'm talking something as simple as showing the financial statements that illustrate how the company was basically losing its ass on these special dividends, and that canceling them would allow the company the capital to cover increased production volume to meet the demands of the market. Or, just remind the court that they were in the middle of a war, and the money they were paying in dividends would be better used keeping the company well supplied with necessary materials at a time where nothing about the future was certain. But Ford didn't go this route. He wanted to be loved, he wanted to be revered, he wanted to be seen as a champion of the worker. And so he went into court and made the asinine argument that the Ford Motor Company didn't just exist to make money. The relevant quote from his testimony, when asked what the company even existed for, if not to generate profits, was that Ford Motor Company was, quote, organized to do as much good as we can, everywhere, for everybody concerned, and, incidentally, to make money. End quote. It probably didn't immediately read as disastrous testimony, but it didn't really look great for Ford, even if Ford himself was probably convinced that it did. He continued fighting this battle in the newspapers, more or less intimating that the wage increase to his workers was a form of wealth redistribution. Yet it would take the court several more months to come to a final determination of how valid it was to screw shareholders in the name of a better world. On December 5th, 1917, the court rendered its judgment against Henry Ford. They not only ordered him to pay $19 million in dividends to the shareholders, the court also imposed the injunction, preventing the construction of the River Rouge factory. It was a crushing blow. So, how did Ford lose such a slam dunk case? Well, again, it goes back to the strategy Henry Ford employed. When he testified that the purpose of Ford Motor Company was to improve lives and incidentally to make money, the word incidentally is what got him into trouble, in my opinion, because it expressed that shareholders weren't the main priority and they weren't even secondary. Their financial well-being was an incidental component of the company's ventures, hardly worth mentioning in the grand scheme of public service. And I think the court probably saw this as a guy trying to run a for-profit business as a non-profit, to say that we're more concerned with being charitable to our workers and to the customer than we are to our own shareholders. And hey, if we just happen to make money doing this, then great. But maybe he could have won if he just said, hey, by being charitable to our workers and to our customers, by offering cars at low prices, this will bring in more money. This is a legitimate approach to bringing in new business. And maybe by providing workers with a better wage, it'll help our reputation just for people to see how well we pay our workers, that we treat them so well, and think, well, hey, this is probably a great company. It's great advertising for them to be able to see people living their best lives as a result of Ford. But he didn't do this. He's just like, we're doing this out of the goodness of our hearts, and we don't really care if we make money, and that's not gonna fly. And you know, what's wild is that all of this is exactly what we would want to hear from corporate executives today. We would want them to say that making money is ancillary to creating quality products that are affordable to consumers, that don't come at the cost of the work-life balance of the people who build them. But I also feel like we would be immediately distrustful of any CEO who did speak this way, because we have the cynicism of late-stage capitalism to teach us that not every figure with wings is an angel. Yet even then, people are complicated, right? I don't like Henry Ford. I think he was a hateful man with a Napoleon complex. But even then, I've got to give him his due credit for things like instituting the 8-hour workday. Because it used to be that your employer could wring you out like an old washcloth and there wasn't really anything you could do about being overworked and underpaid. Okay, I guess we're kind of right back to that, but hey, it could have been a whole lot worse, and Lord knows it used to be. The 8-hour workday was revolutionary for American work-life balance and resulted not only in happier workers, but increased productivity. And look, maybe he was being sincere. Maybe he really did care about the worker in his own way. He did supposedly prefer, or at least really go out of his way to work with farmers. He never let go of that connection to his past. And you know, maybe he did see making money as secondary to improving lives. But that mindset is rarely conducive to long-term success. And honestly, Ford's behaviors within his own company really don't suggest the benevolence he was trying to impart. Not when you're going into people's houses and inspecting their living habits and their hygiene and how they spend their money, to determine whether or not they even deserve the wage increase that you're giving them. Maybe it's your right as a business owner to say that everything has to be on your terms or else you don't get anything, but he was butting into areas of his employees' lives that realistically weren't any of his business. Now, of course, Ford would appeal the decision, taking this all the way to the Michigan Supreme Court. And in this instance, the court more or less made the decision the lower court probably should have, considering that it generally wasn't the duty of the court to interfere in legitimate business practices in instances where there was no evidence of illegal activity. The court rendered their decision on February 7, 1919, ruling that the directors of a corporation have sole discretion over whether or not to declare a dividend, and to decide the amount of that dividend, as long as there's no evidence of fraud or misappropriation of funds, or as long as there's not this extraordinary circumstance in which the company can afford to pay a dividend without hurting the business, but is simply choosing not to. In all other instances, it's up to the board, and the court shall not intervene. Author M. Todd Henderson goes into greater detail on the ruling in his report for the law school at the University of Chicago. Quote, Chief Justice Strander's opinion seemed to deliver victory to both sides. The Dodges would get their special dividend, which the court said was arbitrary for the board to deny them. But Ford would get to build his factory. An injunction to prevent construction was just too risky given the importance of the Ford Motor Company to the American economy, and given the possibility that the court could get the answer wrong. But the court was obviously troubled by Ford's testimony and took the opportunity to chastise him and his firm for following a seemingly non-profit maximizing path. It did so by forcing the dividend and, in powerful and memorable dictum, telling Ford and all other firms that the purpose of corporations is profits. The message from the split decision was clear. Do what you want, but make sure that there is a plausible link with making money. End quote. That powerful and memorable dictum in the court's ruling is the quote that would etch this into the annals of American legal history, ensuring that this would continue to be taught at law schools over the next century, and form the basis for how corporations operate today. Quote, A business corporation is organized and carried on primarily for the profit of the stockholders. The powers of the directors are to be employed for that end. The discretion of directors is to be exercised in the choice of means to attain that end, and does not extend to a change in the end itself, to the reduction of profits, or to the non-distribution of profits among stockholders in order to devote them to other purposes. End quote. The ruling advanced the notion of shareholder primacy, which is more or less what it sounds like, a doctrine that prioritized the interests of shareholders over those of employees and the public. And while it gave Ford a wide berth to dictate his company's fate, it also precluded him from running his for-profit company like a charity. Which is not to say that the company couldn't pursue philanthropic endeavors. They just couldn't do it at the expense of shareholders. And while this was really more of a guide than the official law of the land everywhere, it arguably shaped the future of how American corporations justified their actions, particularly when faced with criticism over not being generous enough or not being benevolent enough, for not doing more for their community or for the world. Because, in a way, it told corporations that profit isn't just good, it's everything. To borrow a Star Trek analogy, this basically gave corporations carte blanche to act like Ferengi. I almost wouldn't be surprised if some CEO somewhere runs his business by the rules of acquisition. But I digress, because Henry Ford was now free to begin constructing the River Rouge facility. Yet he wasn't done trying to rid himself of the Dodge brothers, hatching a new squeeze-out plan to get them out of the company entirely. Author Mark Rowe details what happened next. Quote, Ford applied the most powerful squeeze-out pressure he had, but did so outside of the litigation channel. Annoyed that he lost the case and that, in his view, neither the courts nor the shareholders would let him run his company as he wished, Ford threatened to quit running Ford Motor Company. He resigned from the relevant positions. Fear that Henry Ford the gifted manager and herald of the assembly line, would disappear from Ford Motor Company and possibly start up a wholly owned rival automaker seems to have been the central squeeze-out pressure on the Dodge brothers. End quote. Henry Ford was essentially playing his greatest hits, rerunning a version of the tactic he used on Malcolmson, but in this case threatening to create another business rather than actually doing it. But it was arguably more necessary for him now than it had been then, since Ford didn't exactly have the money to buy out all the minority shareholders. Ford had been so overextended from the wage increase, the court battle, and the construction of the River Rouge facility that he had to borrow from banks to keep the company afloat and gather the money to make his buyout offers, particularly now that the Model T wasn't selling like it once had been. And while this squeeze-out maneuver might be part of why he resigned as president of the company in 1918, the first of 2 times he would do this, it might have been out of a desire to refresh the thinking for Ford Motor Company, as he would hand the presidency to his son Edsel Ford. Wanting to move on, the Dodge brothers finally sold their shares in order to focus on the Dodge Brothers Motor Company, offloading their shares for $25 million in 1919. Ford had finally freed his company from the people he viewed as parasites, yet the court case proved to have the desired effect for the Dodge brothers as well. The first car to roll off the line from the River Rouge facility wouldn't come until 1927, and by that point, smaller automakers had the lead time to establish themselves in the market. Chrysler was on the rise, beginning its climb to Big Three automaker status, while Alfred P. Sloan had implemented a strategy at General Motors to build vehicles for multiple different segments and price points, otherwise known as his price ladder approach, with cars, quote, for every purse and purpose, end quote. Yet even when Ford Motor Company faced the encroachment of new rivals on the auto market, they still managed to find a way to come out on top. In 1922, Ford purchased Lincoln Motor Company from Henry Leland, the man whose hiring at the Henry Ford Company had prompted Ford's own resignation less than a year after he co-founded it. But sadly, despite their victory in court, the Dodge brothers didn't get to enjoy it. The brothers attended the New York Auto Show in 1919, a typically benign excursion for 2 rough-and-tumble men like John and Horace Dodge. But this was during the 3rd wave of the Spanish flu, because apparently having to live through a world war wasn't devastating enough for society already. The Spanish flu ravaged the world. The following is collected testimony of the 1918 flu pandemic from the Amicus Lectio podcast by Mike Overby to provide context for an illness that claimed more American lives than the First World War. A disease which claimed 50 million lives worldwide and infected roughly 500 million, or 1/3 of the global population at the time.
All of a sudden, as I recall it, out in Kansas, one soldier got the Spanish flu. And from there, it gradually spread to various parts of the country. I would say the most horrible thing of that whole epidemic was that the crisis came so rapidly. The crisis came within the first 2 to 3 hours of your sickness. You either survived or you were dead. When the flu epidemic hit, somebody would ring, let's say they rang the doorbell at 6 a.m. in the morning and said, my mother just passed away. I want you to take care of the funeral service. That before the sunset on that day, that whole family was gone. Of the 8 people that lived there, I'm the only one that got it, believe it or not. Fortunately, we had a very wonderful doctor. And he took care of me, and he pulled me out through very quickly because, as I said, the crisis is there. It came with an intense fever, and you were gone. Everybody wore these face masks, like you see in a surgical room. And, you must remember this, that in the flu epidemic, all congregations and gatherings were forbidden. There were no schools, there were no church services, there were no meetings of any kind. Everything was forbidden of people to come together. You had to keep people apart from one another so that the infection wouldn't spread so rapidly. The memories were so deep in their mind of those that survived or that didn't get it, they were reticent. I would say to about 1922 or thereabouts, where people were willing again to go back to congregating and to feel at ease in church or in school.
Now, with all of this considered, it's hard to imagine why they had the New York Auto Show in 1920, especially considering that New York was an epicenter of the third wave, to my understanding at least. Although feel free to keep me in check in the comments. But needless to say, it really didn't take long for the Dodge brothers to fall ill. John took to bed at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel and never recovered. On January 14th, 1920, John Dodge passed away at the age of 54. The loss devastated Horace, and he tried desperately to regain his health, but his body had been worn down by years of excessive drinking. When Horace Dodge died on December 10th, 1920, at the age of 52, the cause of death was cirrhosis of the liver, exacerbated by the flu and the pneumonia that had followed. While Henry Ford and the Dodge brothers had ended as bitter rivals, there had been a certain respect between them for their pioneering roles in the auto industry. Together they had reached heights few had ever dreamed of reaching, in an industry where even fewer could relate to their struggles. And so Henry Ford not only attended John Dodge's funeral, both he and Edsel were pallbearers at Horace's. With no one to whom they could leave Dodge Brothers Motor Company, John and Horace's widows put it on the market. General Motors offered to take it off their hands for a then unfathomable $124 million plus securities, which they shockingly turned down. The company was eventually purchased by the firm Dillon, Reed & Company in one of the biggest cash deals in the history of American business, a sum of $146 million. Horace's widow, Anna Thompson Dodge, would go on to become one of the wealthiest women in the world, and would help keep her husband's name alive, donating $1 million to the city of Detroit for the construction of the Horace E. Dodge and Son Memorial Fountain, which still stands today, although she would never live to see its construction in 1978. As she died in her home on June 2, 1970, at the age of 103. Although Matilda Dodge Wilson, John's widow, didn't live quite as long, passing away in 1967 at the age of 83, she too was fabulously wealthy as a result of the sale, and would later go on to become the 43rd Lieutenant Governor of Michigan in 1940. Sure, the appointment only lasted for 6 weeks, but still, that's pretty cool. She also co-founded the Oakland campus of Michigan State University, which would later become Oakland University, so that's pretty cool. And all this for dedicating the Dodge Brothers Motor Company to new hands. Of course, the new owners proceeded to tank the company so badly that they probably would have been better off keeping that money in their own pocket, but they were eventually able to salvage things somewhat by selling the company to one Walter Chrysler in 1928. And thanks to that decision, the Dodge name survives in the auto industry to this day. As for Henry Ford, well, his life would go through a whole bunch of other twists and turns that you can hear all about in my RCR Stories video on Fordlandia, and you can find out about the continued adventures of the Ford dynasty through Edsel Ford's son, Henry Ford II, in The History of the Edsel. Both videos are linked in the description. But needless to say, the rivalry between Henry Ford and the Dodge brothers may not have been the most exciting, intense, or long-spanning court case in American history, but its effects were far-reaching. It put social responsibility on the back burner so that even if a corporation did want to do good and be less profit-driven and instead put their time and energies into improving the world through their products, they can't really do that unless those goals are incidental to the primary motivation of making fat stacks. It indirectly gave shareholders the power of intercession to butt into corporate decision-making at the highest levels, even as those shareholders may not have all the facts or know-how with regard to running a company. Of course, I'm not going to sit here and carry water for corporations, especially when it's not as if this is some mandate coded into law around the world. But legal precedent set by Dodge versus Ford shaped American corporate management to such an extent that CEOs more or less became employees of the shareholders themselves. Maybe that's for the better, maybe it's for the worst, I don't know. But for what it's worth, it didn't really seem to be a bad thing for Ford or Dodge in the century since the decision. Ford is still here. Dodge is still here. Hell, the River Rouge facility is still here. And barring disastrous management of the Dodge brand by Stellantis, which honestly isn't that implausible, I'm sure they'll both be here for decades to come. Now here's hoping this doesn't age like milk. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, a comment, or sharing the video with someone you think might enjoy it. I would also like to invite you to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you're notified for every new video. And if you want to see more videos just like this, please consider supporting us on Patreon. The link is in the description. Patreon is really the only way these kinds of videos are possible anymore. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your time and your viewership, and have a great week.